Special thanks for hospitality and transportation. And Daniel, thank you for filming and bringing us together. To all the people who have already been thanked for bringing us together for this really impressive turnout, and certainly to the co-panelists, I'm very privileged to be with you tonight. And I'm also glad that Bill Salzman came up with this title, thinking about drones in light of reality, morality, and legality. And I suppose something we could all agree on as a given is that most politicians are aware that when you send young people off to places that seem remote and far away and sometimes don't even have clear causes behind the war, it's not very popular. And so the existence of unmanned or remotely piloted vehicles that won't require sending people into the war zone could tip the balance for some politicians so that they might feel that provoking a war or goading another country into a war or becoming involved in a war, engaging in a war, could be more plausible. And so this is one reality that, of course, demands careful thought and careful discussion on the part of all of us. And of course, we here in the United States don't have the market cornered on drone technology, so the matter of proliferation is also something that we need to think about and think carefully about. So, thinking about the reality, I thought maybe what I could offer are just some anecdotes from my own experience being either under drones or in proximity to drones, or listening to people who've survived drone attacks. And when I think back to 2006, when I was in Lebanon, I realized I didn't know what a drone was, and I didn't really understand what a woman was trying to tell me until much later. But it was a time when the United States had supplied Israel with Raytheon bunker-busting bombs, and the Israelis had used such a bomb in what was called the Israeli-Hezbollah war in 2006. And the bunker buster had gone right underneath a shelter where people had brought their children to stay. And the war had ended, a ceasefire had been declared, and I was with a small, very small group of internationals who then left Beirut and went to see some of the places where we were told these kinds of massacres had occurred. But what we didn't know is we walked right into the funeral for a child whose mother was distraught with grief, and I could tell because she was wearing a medical hood and a neck brace, and because women, neighbors, were coming and embracing her, that she was the mother of a child who'd been killed. In fact, I could identify the child because on the taxi car doors, taxi drivers had posted a picture of a helmeted relief worker holding aloft the lifeless body of her Zahara. Now, flying above, there was an airborne vehicle. And after 30 minutes of silence, this young mother fixed me with a very intense stare, and she spoke a good deal of English. And she was wincing because of her own injury, and she pointed above, and she said, "Didn't they know? Didn't they see my Zahara? Just she goes stay in basement overnight, and then runs across the road, she comes back to me, I give her breakfast every morning." And you see, flying above us was a drone, doing surveillance still. And that's why she asked me, didn't they know? Didn't they see that was her child? And then she asked her son to bring a picture, and there was a beautiful girl's round face, a very serious face, tousled hair, large brown eyes. And she tapped the plastic over the picture. And then she asked me, "Who is the terrorist? Is she the terrorist?" And I only began to get a glimpse of some of the terror and the fear that people feel when they're under surveillance, or they might be hunted, or they might be attacked. I myself then, I was in Gaza in 2009, and there was a very terrible war going on. This was called Operation Cast Lead. And at first I saw the drones flying overhead when I was waiting to cross into Gaza while the war was going on. And over the last 3 days of that warfare, I was in Rafah near the border, the drones in the daytime were hovering right over where we stayed. And once every 11 minutes, a bomb exploded. And so I began to empathize quite a lot with people who begin to feel like a bore, because you know if the drone was flying overhead in the afternoon, and if a bomb was exploding once every 11 minutes, there's every good chance that you won't be there to see the morning. And I never knew the difference between F-16s or Apache helicopters and Hellfire missiles or drones. Began to understand it because the children explained it to me. When I've been in Afghanistan, I began to understand a different kind of terror that gets caused by drone surveillance. And so let me just tell you that, according to Amnesty International, 2012, every single day in Afghanistan, 400 people are displaced by war. Where can they go? Well, they go to overcrowded refugee camps in cities that can't accommodate them, and they don't have food, and they have just the most pitiful shelter. And in the winter, it becomes so terrible. 100 people froze to death in the winter of 2012. Why do they run? What causes them to just pick up what they can carry and go? Well, I talked to one family in the Charahi Khamba refugee camp, and they were goat herders, and they were quite happy with their lives, really, in the Sangin province of the Helmand, the Sangin district of the Helmand province. But Taliban fighters had moved in close to them, where they were encamped. And for some reason, a drone flew overhead and shot a Hellfire missile into their camp. And it was a dreadful night for them. One man pulled out of his pocket pictures of the crumpled and bloody bodies of 5 children. And he said these were his children, and his wife was also killed. But the brothers said, we have to go. They even left their livestock behind, possibly to thirst and die, because they were afraid that the Taliban would come next and say, you must have given information. And that's why there was an attack here. And so they didn't know where to hide, where to run. And so they came to this overcrowded refugee camp. And the next time that I went to visit them, it was in 2011. And they took me much further back into the camp. And it was so cold. It was January. I was kind of huddling next to a little 9-year-old girl named Jumagul. And then her uncle came over and he unzipped the top of her jacket and pulled it back so that I would see that, according to him, the night that the drone hit, shrapnel amputated her arm. And the sleeve was empty. And next to her, her 17-year-old brother was curled up, almost like in the fetal position, and he was convulsive. And his leg had been mangled in this same attack, and of course they had no money for medication. There was a suggestion that maybe he was withdrawing from opium that had been given to him for the pain. And so I know that I can't, in a journalistic sense, verify what I'm telling you and say this was the date and this was the time and here's the eyewitness, and I know it happened. But when I met Jumahul and her brother, certainly something happened that terrible night. So the realities of people running and fleeing from attacks aren't so very often told to people in the United States. But it's not only the displacement and the fear and the frustration and sometimes the rage that we should try to understand as part of the reality in places like Afghanistan, but also Iraq and Pakistan and Somalia and Yemen, and possibly in Mali and in Libya. It's also that, according to General McChrystal, who was formerly the head of the International Security Assistance Forces in Afghanistan, the arrogance of the usage of drones is now jeopardizing the security of people in the United States, because people become so angry and so enraged and they don't know what to do, and so some will start to either join the ranks of or support insurgent fighters. And of course we have to keep thinking about the proliferation of these weapons, because we love the grandchildren and the next generations coming into our world. We have to think about this proliferation. They're now talking about the phantom ray. And we're not the only ones who will be able to develop new versions of the drones. And the Phantom Ray can be launched from a ship, and it can travel faster than the drones, and it can carry a much heavier payload than the 2 Hellfire missiles and the 500-pound bomb that are typical of the Predator and the Reaper drones. And so this will pull people more and more into the temptation to engage in retaliation, to engage in revenge. But I also want to think with you about the realities experienced by people who themselves are drone operators or drone screeners or intelligence analysts, or people working for the kill chain, for instance, in Oskaloosa, Florida, that has been teamed up with the drone operators in Creech Air Force Base. And I want to invoke the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King: have tough minds, but tender hearts. Tender hearts for people who spend sometimes day after day, sometimes weeks, tracking the high-value target that's assigned to them and watching where that person goes to market and when that person goes to the mosque and how that person interacts with family in the home. And then maybe the word comes, well, now we've ascertained this person is to be assassinated this week, and you're the one responsible to do that impact, and you pull that lever and you see the person's body parts flying across your screen, and then you look at the clock and, oh, it's time for my shift to end. And you get in your car and maybe pick up the child at the soccer field, or go home to have dinner with your family. You're 7,000 or 8,000 miles away from a war zone, and you're 17 inches away from a war zone. So this new 21st century means of making warfare ought evoke in us some very, very serious questions. I think one of the best articles I could recommend to all of us is something that was printed in the Los Angeles Times. And forgive me for going back so far in time, because I know history moves rapidly, but this was actually in February of 2010. The event happened in February of 2010. But it's very, very instructive. There were people who lived in the Daikandi province of Afghanistan. And I know some people from that province, and I know that in its remoteness, it has practices that seem almost unbelievable to us, such that women barely ever leave their home. So what an excitement for women in the Daikandi province who were going to be, along with shopkeepers and some students returning to school and some young people who needed medical care, so there were even infants, going to go on a convoy first to Kandahar, and then others would go on to Kabul. They set off very, very early in the morning, early before dawn, but as they came into the Uruzgan province, they were driving right past, and really just 3.5 miles away from, a reconnaissance team from the United States that had just been dropped off. They were paratroopers, just dropped off on the mountainside. And somebody in Creech Air Force Base is assigned to make sure that no harm comes to this group doing light reconnaissance. Well, then the 3-car convoy comes on the screen. And when you read the transcript of the conversation, it's almost agonizing, because of course the people that are trying to protect the paratroopers, who know that just a year ago there had been people in a similar position who were attacked by the Taliban, want to do their best. But the conversation does start to kind of tip toward everybody presuming the people in that convoy must be, the word that's used is nefarious. When they get out to pray, somehow that sort of tilts it even more, that there's something very suspicious going on here. And so one person says, well, I think I've seen a rifle, and somebody else says, well, that could be a stick, and another says, I think I've identified a child, but another says, well, how come I can't see a rifle and you can see a child? So the conversation is getting more and more heated, and finally, as they're getting closer and closer to where A-team on the ground is, the order is given, can't take any more risks that this isn't Taliban, and the first car explodes. And the third car explodes. And then some people with very bright colored clothing, as survivors, were trying to wave their scarves or their clothes to say, we need help. And then the reality came forth. Shopkeepers, students, 4 children, no Taliban fighters. And so the reality we face is one which requires a great deal of discussion, a great deal of thought, a great deal of empathy. Empathy for people who've meant us no harm, I think about my young friend Ras Muhammad and his brother-in-law was a graduate of the police academy. The family in Maidan Bardak was so proud, and he was sitting in a garden with 4 of his friends, and all of a sudden a Hellfire missile was fired by a U.S. drone. The 5 men were killed instantly. And his sister said, I never want to see this carnage afflict anyone, anywhere. But the mother was livid. She said, they do not ask, who is this and why was that? I go to the authority and I ask, why you kill my son? And they tell me there were doubts, there were suspicions. And she understood. She wasn't a jurist, she wasn't a lawyer, but she understood the wrongfulness of killing another person on a doubt or on a suspicion.